The embargo on Southern presidents, the fact that it was caused by the Jim Crow system in the South, had put the South and the nation in what you could almost call the perfect catch-22 system. You know, the old catch-22 where you can't solve the problem until the problem is already solved. The United States couldn't elect a Southern president until the South abandoned its Jim Crow system. Because for the reasons that I said, any Southern politician would have to hand out too many IOUs to the white supremacists in the South and could never be a viable national candidate. But the Jim Crow system in the South could never be dismantled until there was a Southern president. Now, in fact, we can see this in the case of Kennedy and Johnson. Kennedy belatedly introduced or sponsored legislation on civil rights. This was in the autumn of 1963. And the legislation went nowhere. Why? Because those Southerners in the Senate would not be lectured to on the subject of civil rights by some damn Yankee, by some Northern liberal. You know, they're not going to take lessons on how to run the affairs of the South from John Kennedy. Who the hell does John Kennedy think he is? He may be President of the United States, but that's not good enough for us. A Southern president, however, could persuade those Southerners to get with the program and get into the 20th century. It's sort of like Richard Nixon having to be the one to go to China. You will listen to advice probably by somebody who's on the inside. You won't take advice from somebody on the outside. It's very much how it works in families. Now, families can say honest, frank, even nasty things about one another. If somebody from the outside starts to criticize the family, then the family closes ranks. So Johnson could, as a Southerner. Now, see, this is interesting, because for all that time while Johnson was trying to get to be president, he wanted to downplay the Southern roots. He wanted to act as though he was a Westerner. And now, though, as president, when he's trying to get the South to change its system, all of a sudden he starts to sound more Southern. And this is where there was, some of you may have heard this or encountered it, but in an earlier generation, there was a pronunciation in the South of the word Negro that came out like Nigra, and just was right on that border between Negro and nigger. And if you said it just right, it could be interpreted whichever way suited your purposes. And Johnson mastered this. So when he was talking to the white supremacists, it came out sounding the way you would imagine. When he was talking to another audience, it came out sounding like Negro, which was acceptable. And this is emblematic of Johnson's ability to play the Southern card as well as to play the national card. Because what Johnson needed to do to the South was convince the South to enter the rest of the country, to get along with the rest of the country. Johnson's experience in the Senate was absolutely crucial here, because he needed to get the support of the Senate minority leader, Everett Dirksen of Illinois. And Dirksen was a conservative Republican from Illinois, which, certainly downstate Illinois, has a long history of being almost as Southern as much of the South. But Johnson was a master of what came to be called the Johnson treatment. And this was Johnson working one-on-one against various legislators. And I really should stop and save this for a subsequent lecture, but since I've mentioned the Johnson treatment, I'll just tell you how it worked. Lyndon Johnson was a big guy. He was about 6'4". He was really rangy. He had long arms, he had this big head, big nose, big ears. And he used to physically overpower people. He would invite them into the White House, to the Oval Office, which was intimidating enough as it was. And then he'd be kind of lounging behind his chair. He often would slump way down low in his chair, but when he really wanted to make a point, he'd rise up out of that chair. And just for an ordinary sized legislator, then he'd come and he'd sort of stand over them. And there were two versions of the Johnson treatment. There was the half Johnson and the full Johnson. The half Johnson, he'd put one arm around the poor legislator, and he would start thumping him on the chest with the index finger of his free arm. And if you watch the old TV show Seinfeld, there was an episode, a famous episode there on the close talker. You know the one about the close talker, the guy who talks too close? You know, we all have this certain sense of what our physical space should be. Well, the close talker would just invade that space. That's what Johnson would do. And you'd want to get away. Except Johnson would have his arm around you. And if the half Johnson didn't work, then you'd go to the full Johnson. This is both arms around you. And he's leaning down on you like this. And when Johnson got excited, spittle fly out of his mouth. And these poor imprisoned legislators, they would do anything to get out of his grasp. One more instance, then I will stop. Jack Valenti, who was a junior staffer in the Johnson administration, was invited to join the administration. Johnson wanted him to take on, so I can't remember what particularly difficult, distasteful task was. And so he invited Valenti down to the range, Johnson's ranch in Texas, the Texas Hill Country. And whether Johnson did this by design or it just sort of came instinctively to him is hard to say. Because with really natural politicians, the dividing line between what they're calculating and doing and what comes naturally is almost impossible to determine. Anyway, Johnson invites Valenti into the swimming pool. Now, Johnson had this habit of inviting people to go swimming. And they would say, well, sorry, I didn't bring a swimsuit. And Johnson would go, don't worry, we don't wear swimsuits around here. In this case, though, he said, no, okay, we got a swimsuit for you. So Valenti got in the pool. Johnson, I say, was a tall guy. Valenti's fairly short. Valenti is, I don't know, 5'8", something like that. And Johnson positioned himself in the swimming pool, in that place between the shallow end and the deep end, where he could stand with his feet on the bottom of the pool, but where Valenti had to tread water. And so Johnson kept telling him how important this was, and how his country needed him, and how he just wouldn't let him away from there until he said yes. And what it meant for Valenti was he was going to drown unless he said yes. And sure enough, he said yes. Anyway,